The rain started around 11. I remember because I had been watching the clock on the microwave, the one with the broken colon that never blinked, watching the numbers sit there like a sentence I didn't want to finish reading. 11:03, 11:07, 11:14. I kept thinking that if I watched long enough, something would change. Not the numbers. Me. I thought maybe I would finally stop shaking. My name is Kip Miles. I am 22 years old, I am an Omega, and at 11:47 on a Tuesday night in the middle of the coldest month of the year. I was standing in a hallway with a garbage bag full of my belongings and nowhere to go. The apartment door behind me had just been locked. I heard the deadbolt turn. I heard the chain slide into place. I stood there for a long moment listening to those sounds settle into the silence of the hallway, and I thought, this is what the end of something feels like. Not dramatic, not loud, just a deadbolt and a chain and the hum of a fluorescent light that had been flickering since I moved in 8 months ago. Darian had not yelled. That was the part one kept replaying. I had expected yelling. Darian was the kind of person who filled rooms with his voice even when he was happy, and I had been bracing for the version of him that came out when he was angry. Instead, he had been very quiet. He had looked at me the way you look at something you are trying to figure out how to throw away, and then he had handed me the garbage bag he had already packed, and he had said, very calmly, I am not doing this. You need to leave. I had not argued. I think that was the part that surprised me most about myself. 8 months of building a life around a person, and when he handed me a garbage bag and told me to go, I just took it. Maybe I already knew. Maybe some part of me had been standing by the door for weeks, code already on, just waiting for someone to open it. I pressed my back against the wall across from his door and slid down until I was sitting on the floor. The hallway smelled like the neighbor 3 doors down who cooked with too much oil. And like the cleaning product the building manager used on Thursdays, and faintly, underneath both of those, like rain coming through a window that was not quite sealed somewhere above me. I put my hand on my stomach. 7 weeks. That was what the test had said, and then what the second test had confirmed, and then what the third test, the one I had bought in a different pharmacy 2 neighborhoods away because I was too embarrassed to buy another one in the same place, had confirmed again. 7 weeks, and I had been carrying this information around for 4 days like something fragile I did not know how to set down. I had told Darian tonight because I thought I should. Because it seemed wrong to keep it from him. Because some part of me, the part that was apparently very stupid and very slow to learn, had thought that telling him might change something. That it might make us into the kind of people we had never actually been. It had not changed anything. Except now I was in the hallway. The fluorescent light flickered. I counted the flickers. I was on 12 when I heard a door open at the far end of the hallway, and I looked up. Apartment 14. The last door on the right, at the end of the corridor where the hallway turned a corner and got narrower and darker. Where the overhead light had been burned out for 2 months because apparently no one in this building was willing to be the person who reported it. I had walked past that apartment 100 times. I had never once seen the door open. I had never once seen whoever lived there. The building had a reputation for that apartment, the way buildings sometimes develop reputations around specific units and specific people. I had heard things in the elevator, in the lobby, in the laundry room, in the basement where people seemed to talk more freely because the machines were loud and they thought no one could hear them. I had heard that the man in 14 was not someone you bothered. I had heard that he had moved in 3 years ago and in 3 years had never once attended the building's annual summer barbecue or the holiday party in December that the building manager organized with deeply misplaced optimism. I had heard that he was large and that he was quiet and that his quiet was not the comfortable kind. I had heard his name once, from the woman in apartment 7 who seemed to know everything about everyone in the building and was not shy about sharing it. Reuben Strong. She had said the name the way you say the name of a weather system. Not with fear exactly, but with the kind of respect you give to something that could flatten you if it wanted to. And now his door was open. I could not see him clearly from where I was sitting. The far end of the hallway was dim, and he was standing partly in shadow, partly in the light that spilled from inside his apartment. What I could see was that he was tall. Very tall. The kind of tall that makes a doorframe look like it was designed as a suggestion. I could see the breadth of his shoulders. I could see that he was looking in my direction. We stayed like that for a moment, him standing at the far end of the hallway, me sitting on the floor with a garbage bag and a secret I had just told to the wrong person. Then he stepped fully into the hallway and walked toward me, and with each step I could see him more clearly, and I thought, the woman in apartment 7 was not exaggerating. He was, objectively, the most intimidating-looking person I had ever seen in a residential hallway. Or possibly anywhere. He was somewhere in his early 30s, I thought, with a face that seemed to have been assembled with economy in mind. Nothing wasted, nothing soft, dark eyes that caught the flickering light and held it. He was wearing a plain dark shirt and sweatpants, the clothes of someone who had been awake at midnight not because they wanted to be but because sleep had not arrived yet. He stopped about 4 feet from me. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked at the garbage bag. Then back at me. He said, "Are you hurt?" His voice was low, not in the performed way, not the kind of low that men sometimes affect when they want to sound serious. Just genuinely low, like it came from a deeper register than most voices occupied. I said, "Number. I am fine." He looked at me the way someone looks at a statement that does not match the available evidence. I said, "I just need a minute." He looked at the door behind me. He looked at me again. He said, "It is almost midnight and it is raining." I said, "I know." He said, "Do you have somewhere to go?" I opened my mouth to say yes, because saying yes felt like the version of this that preserved some dignity. But I had been sitting on this floor for somewhere between 10 and 15 minutes already and my back was starting to ache and the garbage bag next to me was starting to feel like the most accurate summary of my life I had ever encountered. And something in me just could not make the word come out. I said, "Not immediately. I will figure it out." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Come inside." I looked up at him. I said, "I do not know you." He said, "Number. But the hallway is not somewhere to sit at midnight." It was not a warm offer. It was not accompanied by a smile or an outstretched hand or any of the softness that you might expect from someone inviting a stranger into their home. It was stated the way someone states a fact about temperature or distance. Simply, without decoration. I do not know why I stood up. I have thought about this many times since, tried to work out the logic of it, and I cannot find a clean explanation. Maybe it was that he did not try to charm me. Maybe it was that the hallway was cold and my back hurt and the rain was getting louder against the window at the end of the corridor. Maybe it was that I was 22 years old and 7 weeks pregnant and sitting on a hallway floor with everything I owned in a garbage bag. And at that particular moment the scariest man in the building seemed like a better option than the night. I picked up my bag. I stood up. I followed him down the hallway to apartment 14. He held the door open. I walked in. His apartment was nothing like I expected. I do not know what I expected, exactly. Something spare, maybe. Something that matched the impression of him, all edges and economy. But the apartment was warm, and it was full of books. Not arranged books, not the kind of shelves that people put up because they want visitors to know they read. These were books that had been used. They covered 2 full walls in mismatched shelves. They were stacked on the floor in organized towers. They were open on the coffee table and on the arm of the couch and on the kitchen counter. There was a reading lamp in the corner that was still on, casting a circle of amber light over an armchair with the particular depression of something that had been sat in thousands of times. I stood in the entryway and looked at the room and felt something shift slightly inside me. Not safety, not exactly. But something adjacent to it. The room had the feeling of a place that knew what it was. He said, "You can sit down." I went to the couch and sat. He went to the kitchen, which was separated from the living area by a short counter, and I heard water running, and then the sound of something being set on a burner. I looked at the books nearest to me on the coffee table. History, philosophy, one on cartography, one that appeared to be an extremely dense volume about materials engineering. I felt oddly reassured by this. A person who read about cartography at midnight was not, probably, a person who had terrible plans. He came back with a mug and set it on the table in front of me. I looked at it. Steam was rising from it. I said, "What is this?" He said, "Hot water with lemon and ginger." "You look cold." I wrapped my hands around the mug. I was cold. I had not let myself notice it until the warmth of the ceramic was against my palms, and then I noticed it very much. I said, "Thank you." He sat in the armchair. He did not look at me with the kind of scrutinizing attention that makes you feel like a problem being assessed. He just settled into the chair with the ease of a person settling into something familiar, and he picked up the book that had been resting on the arm, and he opened it. I sat with my mug and stared at him. He was reading. He was genuinely just reading. I said, "Are you not going to ask me anything?" He turned a page. He said, "Do you want me to?" I thought about it. I said, "I do not know." He said, "Then I will wait until you know." I took a sip of the hot water. The ginger was sharp and the lemon was tart and together they were exactly what my stomach needed. And I did not know how he had known that except that maybe he had just looked at me and made a reasonable inference. I said, I am Kip. Kip Miles. He said, without looking up, Reuben Strong. I said, I know. The woman in apartment 7 talks. He turned another page. A very slight expression moved across his face, too small and too fast to fully read, but it was there. I said, she said you were not someone to bother. He said, she is mostly right. I said, are you bothered right now? He looked up at me then. His eyes were dark and direct and they held mine for a moment before he said, no. He went back to his book. I drank my hot water. The rain tapped against his windows, which were better sealed than whichever window was open somewhere above my old floor. I sat in Reuben Strong's apartment and listened to rain and the soft turn of pages and the settling sounds of a building at midnight, and I thought about the fact that I was 7 weeks pregnant and homeless and sitting in a stranger's living room. And somewhere in the middle of all that thinking I fell asleep. I woke up with a blanket over me. It was the kind of blanket that is heavy enough to be meaningful, dark gray, soft in the way of something washed many times. It was tucked around me with a precision that suggested it had been placed by someone who did not want to wake me, who had moved carefully and quietly and had made a decision to let me sleep. The reading lamp in the corner was still on but the overhead lights were off. I could hear, from somewhere else in the apartment, the very faint sound of steady breathing that meant Reuben Strong had gone to sleep. The clock on his microwave, which I could see through the kitchen doorway, said 3:22. I lay there in the dark and quiet of his apartment and thought about what I was going to do. The honest answer was that I did not know. I had $240 in my bank account. I had a phone that needed charging. I had a garbage bag full of clothes and the things from my bathroom shelf and 3 books I had not finished reading and a small framed photograph of my mother, who lived on the other side of the country and did not know any of this was happening. I had a lease that was technically in Darian's name because he had moved in first and I had just stayed. I had a job as an editorial assistant at a small publishing imprint that paid me enough to cover half of rent and groceries if I was careful, but which was not, in any honest accounting, enough to cover rent by myself in this city. And I had 7 weeks along and not going anywhere, a fact that was growing whether I was ready for it or not. I pressed my hand to my stomach in the dark. I said, quietly, to no one, or maybe to the only one who was listening, I am going to figure this out. I promise. I was not sure I believed it yet, but it seemed important to say. He was already awake when I opened my eyes again. The clock said 7:09. The rain had stopped and the light coming through the windows was the particular white-gray of a morning that had not yet decided what kind of day it wanted to be. Reuben was standing at the kitchen counter with a cup of coffee, reading something on his phone, still in the same dark shirt and sweatpants from the night before. He had not heard me wake up, or if he had, he was giving me the space of not acknowledging it. I sat up. The blanket fell to my lap. I said, good morning. He looked over. He said, good morning. There is coffee if you want it. I said, I should not drink coffee. He did not ask why. He just turned back to the counter and I heard the sound of a kettle being filled, and a few minutes later he set a new mug on the coffee table in front of me. Hot water again, this time with just lemon. I said, you do not have tea? He said, I do not drink tea. I said, but you made lemon water twice. He said, I keep lemon and ginger for when I am sick. You looked like you needed something warm. I wrapped my hands around the mug and looked at him. He had gone back to his phone. He was reading whatever he was reading with the focused stillness of someone who was genuinely interested in it, not performing occupation, not keeping himself busy to avoid something. I said, I am pregnant. I did not plan to say it. It came out the way things come out when you have been holding them in the dark for too long and the morning finally cracks you open. He looked up from his phone. He looked at me for a long moment, his expression doing nothing dramatic, nothing performative. Just receiving the information. He said, how far along? I said, 7 weeks. He said, and the person whose door that is. It was not a question, really. He had made the inference. I nodded. He said, did he know before last night? I said, number. I told him last night. He gave me a garbage bag and told me to leave. A silence. Then Reuben said, in a tone that was completely flat, that is not something I will say anything about out loud. I almost laughed. It surprised me, the almost laugh, the way it rose up from somewhere under all the weight of the last 12 hours. I pressed my lips together and looked down at my mug. I said, I do not have anywhere to go today. I know that is not your problem. I am going to call some people this morning and figure something out. I just need a few hours. He said, you can stay today. I said, Reuben, He said, I am home. I work from here. It is not inconvenient. I said, you do not know me. He said, I am aware of that. I said, you let a stranger sleep on your couch. He said, the hallway alternative was not acceptable. I looked at him. He looked back at me with the same directness he had had since the moment I first saw him. Not unkind, not warm in any obvious way, just straightforward in the way of someone who does not see the point of pretending otherwise. I said, what do you do? You said you work from here. He said, I am a structural engineer. Consulting. I work on my own schedule. I said, and you live alone? He said, yes. I said, and you are comfortable with a stranger sitting in your living room all morning? He said, I have been alone a long time. Having someone else in the room is not a problem for me. It was such an honest thing to say. Not sad, not asking for anything, just precise. I had been alone a long time. I thought about what it would feel like to say that about yourself and mean it the way he seemed to mean it, without resentment or longing, just as information. I said, okay, thank you. He nodded and went back to his phone. I took out my own phone, which was at 11% battery, and started going through my contacts trying to figure out who to call. If you are still watching, subscribe so you never miss a story like this. Now let's see what happens next. The morning passed in a way I had not expected, which was quietly and without crisis. Ruben worked at his desk, which was against the wall in the corner near the larger bookshelf, with 2 monitors and a drafting surface and a kind of focused intensity that made him easy to forget about in a comfortable way, the way a hearth fire is easy to forget about because it is doing its job steadily and doesn't need your attention. I called my friend Della, who was theoretically my closest friend in the city and who I thought might let me stay on her couch for a few days. Della had a small apartment in a different neighborhood and a good heart in extremely unpredictable circumstances, and when I reached her she was in the middle of a week-long visit from her own family, her mother and 2 younger siblings occupying every sleeping surface she had. She was sorry. She sounded genuinely sorry. She said she would figure something out by next week. I called my colleague Petter from work, who was not exactly a close friend but who I knew had a second room. Petter said the second room was currently being used as a recording studio for a podcast he was developing and that it was full of equipment. This did not seem insurmountable to me, but I could not explain that to Petter without it becoming a whole negotiation. I called my friend from before the city, from the town I had grown up in, and was sent to voicemail. I put my phone down. It was at 3% now. I said, Ruben, can I charge my phone? He said, without looking up, there is a charger on the kitchen counter next to the coffee maker. I plugged my phone in and sat back down on the couch and looked at the ceiling. Around 11, he stood up from his desk and went to the kitchen and started making breakfast without saying anything. I watched him crack 4 eggs into a pan. I watched him put bread in a toaster. I watched him, with what appeared to be complete unconscious habit, plate half of everything and bring it to the coffee table and set it in front of me. He went back and ate at the counter standing up, reading something on his phone again. I said, you made me breakfast. He said, I made breakfast. There is enough for 2. I said, Ruben. He said, eat. I ate. The eggs were simple and good, just salt and pepper, no performance, the kind of cooking that comes from knowing what you like rather than trying to impress. The toast was slightly overdone in the way that suggests a person who gets distracted and then just accepts the results. I said, your toast is burnt. He said, I know. I always do that. I said, you could just take it out earlier. He said, I always forget. I ate the not burnt half of my toast, which was the half he had given me, and tried not to make too much of that. By noon I had accepted that I was not finding alternative accommodation today. I had 43 unread work emails because I had not opened my laptop since yesterday afternoon and my job was in a constant state of low-level editorial emergency that I was expected to be part of managing. I asked Ruben if I could use the space at the end of his counter to work, explaining that I had my laptop in my bag and that I would be quiet. He said, of course. You do not need to ask. I set up my little corner of his counter and opened my laptop and spent 3 hours doing the work of pretending my life was normal. Editing manuscript feedback, responding to author queries, approving cover copy. The particular discipline of a professional life that continues regardless of personal upheaval is something I both relied on and resented. And that afternoon I was grateful for it in the way you are grateful for a handhold when you are on a surface you are not sure about. At some point he made tea. Not for himself, he did not drink tea, but he had apparently looked up what was safe for early pregnancy and come back from the kitchen to set a cup of mild ginger tea next to my laptop. He said nothing about it. He just went back to his desk. I stared at the cup for a moment. I said, "Did you just research pregnancy safeties?" He said, "You said you could not drink coffee." I said, "So you looked it up?" He said, "It was not complicated research." I said, "Ruben." He said, "The tea will get cold." I drank the tea. I went back to my emails. I thought about the fact that this man who was, by the building's collective assessment, someone who did not bother, had let me sleep on his couch and made me breakfast and looked up safe teas and had done all of this without making any of it into something I would need to feel indebted by or complicated about. He just did these things the way he did everything else, with a straightforwardness that had no performance in it. By 4 in the afternoon I had to confront the fact that I had no place to sleep tonight. I closed my laptop. I said, "I need to find somewhere to stay tonight." He did not look up immediately. He finished what he was writing. Then he looked over at me and said, "You can stay here." I said, "Ruben, I cannot keep imposing." He said, "It is a couch in a room I am already occupying. It is not an imposition." I said, "That is a very specific way to frame charity." He said, "I am not doing it out of charity." I said, "What are you doing it out of?" He was quiet for a moment. He said, "You needed somewhere. I have somewhere. That is the whole of it." I looked at him. He had turned back to his monitors and was typing again. I thought about pushing back on this, about making the argument that there were things I could find, options I could create, a solution that did not involve a stranger's couch. I thought about the $240 in my bank account. I thought about how tired I was, a tiredness that was not just the kind from a difficult night but the deep specific exhaustion of early pregnancy that I had been fighting for 2 weeks. I said, "Just for a few days. While I figure things out." He said, "As long as you need." I was in Ruben Strong's apartment for 9 days before I found something else. It should have been strange. 2 people who did not know each other, sharing 70 square feet of communal living space, navigating around each other's habits and schedules and silences. But Ruben was, it turned out, a person who occupied space with precision. He knew where his edges were. He was not someone who sprawled into your world without invitation. He kept to his routines, his work at the desk, his evening reading in the armchair, his early sleep and earlier wake, and he made room within those routines for my presence without making it into an issue. I learned things about him the way you learn things about a place you are living in, not through direct inquiry but through observation and proximity. He drank his coffee black and made it in a small stovetop pot that took 4 minutes and produced something strong enough to be taken seriously. He was up by 6 every morning and the coffee was made by 6:03. He ran, I eventually understood, because on the 3rd morning I woke up at 6:45 and he was coming back in with sweat on his shirt and the particular looseness of someone who had been moving hard for 40 minutes. He ate with regularity and without excitement. Breakfast was eggs, almost always. Lunch was something assembled quickly at the counter, usually left over from whatever he had made the night before, because he cooked in the evenings and in quantities that made sense for 2 people now that there were 2 people. He had not made any comment about this. He had just started cooking more. He read constantly. Not always books, sometimes papers, sometimes things on his second monitor that I caught glimpses of when I was walking past. Dense technical documents with structural diagrams and load calculations. But in the evenings it was always books, always the armchair, always the reading lamp. He read with the unhurried absorption of someone who is going somewhere specific and does not need to rush to get there. He did not talk much. This I had known from the first night. But I was learning the difference between his silences. There was the silence of focus when he was working and the rest of the world was muffled and it was not personal. There was the silence of processing when you had said something that he was taking the time to actually think about before responding, which was disconcerting at first and then, once I understood it, became one of the things I liked best about talking to him. And there was the silence of presence, which was the one I was most familiar with by day 4 or 5, the silence of someone who was simply there with you. Not requiring conversation, not making absence into a message. Just there. On the 4th day I found his record player. It was in the corner behind one of the bookshelves, half hidden, a turntable and a small stack of records. I pulled one out and looked at it and turned around to find him watching me from his desk. I said, "Can I?" He said, "Yes." I put the record on. It was something old, jazz I thought. The kind with a late-night unhurried feel. A trumpet doing something complicated and patient over a rhythm section that knew exactly where it was. I looked at Ruben and found him looking at the record player with an expression that was soft in a way I had not seen on him before. I said, "Is this your music?" He said, "My father's. He gave me the records when I moved here." I said, "Do you listen to them often?" He said, "Sometimes." When the work is heavy. I said, is the work heavy today? He said, it was. It is lighter now. I did not quite know what to do with that, so I went back to the couch and sat with my knees pulled up and listened to the record and tried not to examine too closely the warmth that had settled somewhere in my chest. On the 5th day I was sick. Not dramatically sick, not crisis sick, but the particular deep nausea of the first trimester that arrives in the mornings and sometimes in the evenings and sometimes in the middle of a completely neutral afternoon for no reason anyone has ever satisfactorily explained. I was sitting on the bathroom floor with my back against the cool of the tub, and I heard a knock on the door. He said, from the other side, Kip. I said, I am fine. A pause. Then, I know. I have crackers. I opened the door. He was standing there with a small plate of plain crackers and a glass of water with ice in it. He handed them through the door. He did not try to come in. He did not make a face that said he found this uncomfortable or inconvenient. He just handed me the things and said, call if you need anything, and went back to his desk. I sat on the bathroom floor with my crackers and my ice water and thought very hard about not making anything out of this. I was not entirely successful. On the 7th evening, we talked for the first time in a way that went past the logistical. I was sitting on the couch after dinner, which we had eaten together at the table because somewhere around day 4 eating at the counter alone had given way to eating at the table together, and I said, how long have you lived in this building? He said, 3 years. I said, where were you before? He said, a different city. I came here for a contract and then stayed. I said, why did you stay? He said, the work was here. And I found I liked it. I said, you like the city? He said, I like having somewhere I know. I like the routes I run. I like the shop on the corner that opens at 5:30 in the morning. I like the bookshop 2 streets over that does not care how long you stay. I said, the building said you never go to the social events. He said, the building is correct. I said, but you like it here. He said, liking a place is not the same as needing to socialize in it. I like being in the city. I do not need to attend a summer barbecue to confirm that. I said, the woman in apartment 7 says you are frightening. He said, she has said that to my face as well. I said, what did you say? He said, nothing. It is not inaccurate. I looked at him. He was looking at his coffee cup with a sort of settled equanimity, neither bothered by the assessment nor pretending it was untrue. I said, you do not frighten me. He looked up at me then. Something shifted in his expression. Something too careful and too quick for me to fully catch. He said, good. He went back to his book. I went back to my laptop. The jazz record was playing again, the same one from 3 days ago, the trumpet doing its patient complicated thing. I found a sublet on the 9th day. A room in a shared flat with a woman named Sarah who was going abroad for 4 months and needed someone reliable to take her room and cover her portion of utilities. It was small and it was in a neighborhood I did not know well and it was affordable. Which in this context meant possible, and I took it. I told Ruben that evening. I was sitting at the table with my laptop, having just signed the subletting agreement and paid the deposit, which had required a very careful accounting of my finances that I was trying not to look at too directly. He said, when do you move in? I said, Saturday. 2 days. He said, I see. A silence. He was looking at his food. I was looking at him looking at his food. I said, I wanted to say that I am very grateful. What you did for me was. It was significant, Ruben. I want you to know that. He said, you do not need to make a speech. I said, I am not making a speech. I am telling you something true. He looked up at me. He said, I know it is true. You do not need to formalize it. I said, then I am telling you informally. He said, accepted, informally. I smiled at my food. I said, will you be all right, after? Going back to just yourself? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, it will be different. Not, yes, fine, of course. Not a reassurance. Just different. I thought about that word and what it meant coming from someone who chose his words as carefully as Ruben chose his. I said, would it be all right if I came to see you sometimes? He said, yes. I said, I do not want to bother you. He said, I told you once before that you do not bother me. I said, I know. I just want to make sure the invitation is standing. He said, it is standing. The next 2 days passed in the particular thickness of time that comes when you are aware that something is ending. I moved through the routines we had built, the morning lemon water, the breakfast, the parallel work at desk and counter, the evening meal, the record and the reading, and I was conscious of each of them in a way I had not been before. On Friday night, his last night as my landlord or host or whatever he was, I asked him to play a different record. He went to the shelf and stood looking for a while and then put one on that I had not heard before, slower than the jazz, something older and quieter that was all piano and a voice that came and went like weather. We did not talk for most of the evening. We just existed in the same room with the music. When I went to make up the couch for the last time, I turned around and he was still in the armchair watching me with an expression I did not have a name for yet. I said good night. He said good night. I lay in the dark with the blanket over me that smelled now like his apartment, like books and coffee and the particular clean scent of a place that was well cared for, and I thought about the fact that 10 days ago I had not known this person existed. Sarah's room was fine. It was small and the window faced a wall, and the woman I was sharing the flat with, whose name was Jo, was pleasant in a preoccupied way that meant we existed in parallel without much friction. The neighborhood was fine. The commute to work was fine. Everything was fine in the particular way of things that are adequate and functional and cost you nothing except the low continuous awareness that they are not where you want to be. I talked to my mother by video call on the third night in Sarah's room. I told her about the pregnancy. I sat on the narrow bed in the room with the window facing a wall and watched her face move through a sequence of emotions that she was trying to manage because she loved me and she wanted to respond well, and by the end of the call she was crying in a way that was not sad but overwhelmed, and she said, "I am coming to see you as soon as I can arrange it," and I said, "You do not have to," and she said, "Kip, I am coming." She said, "Are you alone?" I said, "I have a good place to stay. I have friends here." I thought about whether Reuben Strong was a friend. I thought about the crackers through the bathroom door and the ginger tea researched at midnight and the not burnt half of the toast. I thought about 8 evenings of jazz records and parallel silences. I thought about his voice saying, simply and without decoration, "It will be different." I said, "Yes, I have friends here." I texted him on the 4th day. I said, "How is the apartment?" He replied after 20 minutes, "Quiet." "How is the room?" I said, "The window faces a wall." He said, "That is unfortunate." I said, "Your windows face other buildings but at least there are pigeons." A pause. "Then, there are 3 pigeons that appear to have a fixed schedule." I said, "You know about the pigeons?" He said, "I have been here 3 years." I smiled at my phone in the room with the wall-facing window. I texted him 2 days later to ask about something I had forgotten at his apartment. A book I had left on the coffee table. He said he had it. He said he could bring it to me, or I could come by. I said I could come by if that was all right. He said it was all right. I went on a Thursday evening after work, and he let me in and the book was on the coffee table exactly where I had left it, and the reading lamp was on, and the apartment smelled like coffee and something cooking. He had made dinner. For 2, without, apparently, questioning whether I would stay. I stayed. We ate and listened to the piano record and I told him about a manuscript I was working on that had a structural problem in the middle section, not something I expected him to find interesting, but he listened with the same focused attention he gave to everything, and when I had finished explaining he asked a question that went directly to the center of the problem in a way that surprised me. I said, "How did you get to that so fast?" He said, "I work with structures. The problem you are describing is structural." I said, "It is narrative." He said, "Is there a difference?" I thought about it. I said, "I think I need to argue with you about this." He said, "You can argue with me here." We argued about the difference between structural integrity and narrative cohesion for 45 minutes, and by the end I had figured out how to fix the manuscript, and I was also laughing in a way I had not laughed since before all of this started, the full body kind that comes from unexpected delight. And Reuben was watching me laugh with an expression that I did not look away from in time. It was not an expression I could misread. It was too direct for that, too unguarded in a face that was otherwise very careful. He was looking at me the way someone looks at something they have been trying not to look at for too long. He looked away first. He said, "You should take the book." I took the book. I stood by his door with it pressed to my chest and I said, "Can I come back on Saturday?" He said, "Yes." I came back on Saturday. I came back the Saturday after that. And the one after that. At some point I stopped needing an excuse and started just coming, and at some point he started having ginger tea ready when I arrived, which required him to buy tea, which meant he had bought tea specifically so it would be there when I came, and I held that fact carefully and did not put it down. I was 12 weeks along when the nausea began to lift, which was, the internet and my midwife both informed me, within normal range, and which felt like surfacing from water I had not realized was over my head until I was out of it. I told Reuben. We were sitting at his table on a Saturday, and I said, "I think the worst of the early sickness is over." He said, "Good, you look better." I said, "Do I?" He said, "Yes, you have had color in your face this week." I said, you have been watching my face for color. He said, I notice things. I said, that is a very calm way to say that. He said, how else would I say it? I looked at him for a long moment. He looked back with that directness that no longer felt like a wall and had not, I realized, felt like a wall for some time. It felt like standing in front of something open, like a door held for you. I said, Ruben, can I ask you something directly? He said, yes. I said, what is happening between us? He did not flinch at the question, did not redirect or hedge. He was quiet for a moment, the thinking silence, the one I knew now, and then he said, I am not certain of the name for it. But I know what it is not. It is not obligation. It is not proximity making something out of nothing. I have been very clear with myself about that. I said, when were you clear about that? He said, when you left. When it was different. I pressed my hands flat on the table. I said, I am having someone else's baby. I am 22 and I have a garbage bag worth of life experience and I am still working out what I want my life to look like. That is a significant amount of complicated. He said, I am aware. I said, and you are still sitting here telling me it is not nothing. He said, yes. I said, why? He said, because I spent 3 years in this building being alone and finding it acceptable. And then you sat down in my hallway and I opened a door and now acceptable is not the word I would use anymore. I sat with that for a moment. I said, you could have left me in the hallway. He said, number. I could not have. I said, Ruben, that was not about me. You did not know me. He said, I know. But I still could not have. I said, what does that mean? He said, it means that some things are simply the case. You were in the hallway at midnight in the rain. I could not have closed the door. I looked at him. He looked at me. The reading lamp was on and the record was playing and somewhere outside on the window ledge one of the 3 scheduled pigeons was doing whatever pigeons do at this hour, and I thought, here is a person who could not close the door. I said, I have not thought about anyone else since I was in your hallway. I want you to know that. He said, I know. I said, how do you know? He said, because I notice things. We were not, in the early weeks of whatever we were to each other, dramatic about it. This was, I suspected, largely due to Ruben's nature. Ruben did not do things dramatically. He did them steadily and with attention, and what he turned that steadiness and attention toward, now, was me. Not in a way that felt like pressure or performance. In a way that felt like being built into someone's structural considerations. Like you had been added to the load-bearing calculations. He came to my midwife appointment at 14 weeks. I had not asked him. I had mentioned the appointment in passing, something about needing to leave his place early on a Wednesday, and he had said, I will take you, and I had started to object, and he had said, I will take you, in the way that was not a demand but was also simply past the point of argument. He sat in the waiting room while I was with the midwife and when I came out he was reading a folded copy of a magazine with the focused expression of a person who had been doing something to keep busy. I sat down next to him and showed him the printout they had given me, the small gray smudged image that was, apparently, a person in the earliest sense of the word. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. I said, that is the situation. He said, yes. I said, it is very small. He said, things that become large usually are, at first. I looked at him. I said, that is either very obvious or very profound. He said, probably both. He drove me home to Sarah's room with the wall-facing window. At the door he said, I will cook on Friday. Come by. I said I would. He had started saying things like that. Come by. I will have. Come for dinner. Statements, not questions, but without the weight of expectation. More like, here is a fact about Friday. The fact being that he wanted me there. I had started noticing his body in a way I was not entirely prepared for. This had been developing for some time. I could trace it back if I was honest, back to the first night and the way he had occupied the doorframe. But it was becoming more present in my awareness and less something I could file under the category of neutral observation. When he reached past me to get something from the shelf behind where I was sitting. When he fell asleep in the armchair sometimes, late in the evenings when the record had run out and neither of us had moved. And his face went somewhere quieter and younger in sleep. When he stood at the counter in the morning and the early light came through the window and lay across the angle of his shoulder. I told Della about him. We had coffee one afternoon, Della and I, in a small place near her apartment, and I had been talking for 20 minutes about Ruben Strong before I realized I had been talking for 20 minutes about Ruben Strong and stopped. Della said, is he the scariest man in the building? I said, that is what people say about him. She said, what do you say? I thought about it. I said, I think he is the most careful man I have ever known. And people misread careful as frightening when they do not know the difference. Della looked at me with an expression that said she had formed a very clear view of the situation and was being restrained about sharing it. I said, it is complicated. She said, it sounds uncomplicated, actually. I said, he is not afraid of any of it. That is what is complicated. He knows all of it, the pregnancy, the situation, everything, and he is not afraid of it. I do not know what to do with that. Della said, maybe you just let it be true. I said, it seems too easy. She said, Kip, you have been alone and sick and scared in a stranger's apartment for half of the last 2 months. You are allowed to let something be easy. At 16 weeks a storm came through the city that was serious enough to make the news. Not catastrophic, but real, the kind of weather that rattles windows and takes down branches and makes the city louder and stranger than usual. I was at Sarah's room and I could not sleep. The window that faced the wall amplified the sounds somehow and the rain was hitting it in sheets, and I lay in the narrow bed listening to the building creak and thought about Ruben's apartment and his sealed windows and the warmth of it. I texted him at 11:30. I said, are you awake? He replied almost immediately, yes. Are you all right? I said, I cannot sleep. The window is not great in weather like this. A pause. Then, come here if you want. I said, it is 11:30. He said, I know what time it is. I said, it is a bad storm. He said, then you should not stay where the window is bad. I put my jacket on over my pajamas. I took an umbrella and walked the 6 blocks to his building. The storm was immediate and loud the moment I stepped outside, the rain sideways and the wind doing something complex in the gaps between buildings, and I walked with my head down and my hand on my stomach in the instinctive protective gesture I had been developing over weeks. And I thought about the fact that I was walking through a storm at 11:30 at night to go to a place I thought of as safe. When I got to his floor, he was in the hallway. Waiting. He was standing outside apartment 14, which was at the far end, and he watched me come down the corridor with my soaking umbrella and my wet jacket, and when I got close enough he took the umbrella from me and said, come in. I was dripping on his floor. I said, I am soaking. He went to the bathroom and came back with a towel, and I dried my face and my hair, and he took my jacket and hung it somewhere, and then he said, are you cold? I said, a little. He put the kettle on. I sat on the couch in my pajamas with my wet hair, and he brought me tea and sat in the armchair, and we were quiet with the storm outside the windows, which were sealed and held everything back to a manageable sound, a dramatic suggestion of weather rather than weather in the room with you. I said, you were awake. He said, yes. I sometimes do not sleep well in storms. I sleep lighter. I said, I thought the storm would not bother you. He said, why? I said, you seem like a person nothing bothers. He said, that is an inference from very limited data. I said, what bothers you? He was quiet for a moment. He said, the usual things. Not being useful, wasting time, getting things wrong in ways that matter. I said, what kinds of things? He said, work things. Calculations that have to be precise because imprecision has consequences. I take that seriously. I said, and non-work things? A longer quiet. Then, saying the wrong thing to someone whose opinion matters. Being unclear about something important and having it cause a problem I could have prevented. I said, is there something important you have been unclear about? He looked at me across the room. He said, I think you know. I said, I want you to say it. He said, Kip. I said, I know what I think is happening. But I want to hear you say it because you are the most precise person I have ever met, and I would like to have the precise version. He set his cup down. He looked at me with the full attention of those dark eyes and he said, I love you. I am aware that it is too fast and too certain for a situation that has only been a few months. I am aware of the complications. I am not asking for anything in return. I am telling you because you asked for the precise version, and the precise version is that I have been in love with you for some time and I am not going to pretend otherwise. I sat on his couch in my pajamas with my damp hair and the storm outside, and I thought about the hallway and the blanket and the toast and the crackers and the tea and the record and the window facing the wall and the Saturday visits and the Thursday dinners and the fact that he had been standing in the hallway waiting for me. I said, I love you too. I have been trying to find a reason why I should not say that, and I cannot find one that I actually believe. He said, good. I said, that is your response? Good? He said, what would you prefer? I said, I do not know. Something more than one syllable maybe. He got up from the armchair and came and sat next to me on the couch, and he was close, the closest we had been in the weeks of careful, calibrated proximity, and he said, I have been thinking about sitting here for some time. I said, on the couch? He said, next to you on the couch. I said, and now you are. He said, yes. I said, what do you want to do about it? He said, whatever you want to do about it. I looked at him. He looked back. The storm was doing its serious work outside the sealed windows, and the reading lamp was on, and the kettle had just finished making its small sounds in the kitchen, and here was Reuben Strong, the scariest man in the building, sitting on his own couch with his shoulder almost touching mine, waiting for me to decide. I leaned toward him. He was very still for a moment, and then he put his arm around me, carefully, the way he did everything, with attention and intention, and I settled against his side, and we sat like that in the lamplight while the storm ran itself out against the windows. He said, quietly, into my hair, you can stay. I said, I know. I said, I think I have been staying for a while. He said, yes. My mother arrived in the city at 18 weeks. She came with one large suitcase and a series of opinions. She was being very disciplined about not sharing until she had understood the situation, which was her approach to most things and which I had always appreciated. I introduced her to Reuben on the second day of her visit. We went to his apartment for dinner, and I watched her watch him the way mothers watch people who are part of their children's lives, with the careful attention of someone running a very specific analysis. Reuben cooked. He made enough for 3 people without comment, without fuss, with the same even competence he brought to everything. He set the table properly. He spoke to my mother with respect and without performing warmth he did not feel, which I knew she would pick up on and value, because she had very little patience for performance. After dinner, while I was washing up, I heard them talking at the table. I could not hear what was said. But when I came back with the tea, my mother's posture had changed to the particular ease that meant she had made a decision about a person and the decision was favorable. Later, when Reuben had stepped out to take a call, my mother said, he is not what I expected. I said, what did you expect? She said, someone showing off. Someone trying to prove he was good enough for the situation. That is what people usually do when they are nervous. I said, he is not nervous. She said, he is certain. That is different, and much rarer. I said, are you going to tell me what you think? She said, I think he looked at you the entire dinner in a way that you do not look at someone you are being careful about. He does not seem to be on his best behavior. He seems to be just himself. I said, he is always just himself. He does not have a best behavior face. He has one face. She said, I know. That is what I mean. She stayed for 10 days, and in those 10 days she helped me start looking at actual apartments, real ones with leases in my name, in the neighborhood near Reuben's building, because I had stopped pretending that geography was not a consideration. She sat with me through spreadsheets of rent calculations and helped me think through what the next year might look like. With the baby coming in spring and the job I needed to negotiate a leave arrangement with, and the question of whether I could afford a 1-bedroom or whether a studio with a proper sleeping area was the more honest answer. On her last night, she said, you are going to be all right, Kip. I want you to know I see that clearly. I said, do you? She said, you have built something here. Not just the Reuben part. All of it. You sat on a hallway floor at midnight and you got up and you kept building. That is who you are. I did not cry. I thought about crying and chose not to, which felt like a small victory of a kind I had been accumulating over the past weeks. She flew home the next morning. Reuben drove us to the airport. He shook my mother's hand and she held it with both of hers for a moment and said something to him quietly, and he nodded, and then she went through the doors and he drove me back to the city in a comfortable silence that I was fully at home in now. I said, in the car, what did she say to you? He said, she said take care of her. She said she was counting on me. I said, what did you say? He said, I said she could. I found the apartment at 20 weeks. It was 2 floors above Reuben's, in the same building, which I had not planned and which I also could not pretend was a coincidence, because the moment the building manager mentioned the vacancy I had called immediately with a speed that was not compatible with coincidence. It was a 1-bedroom. Small, clean, with windows that faced the courtyard rather than a wall, with a kitchen that was slightly larger than Reuben's and a bathroom with a deep tub that I thought about with something close to reverence. The bedroom had enough space for a bed and, eventually, beside it, something smaller. I signed the lease on a Thursday. I told Reuben that evening. I said, I found an apartment. He said, in this building. I said, how did you know? He said, the manager mentioned the vacancy last week. I had a feeling. I said, you did not say anything. He said, it was your decision. I said, but you hoped. He was quiet for a moment. Then, precisely, yes. I moved in 3 weeks later, which at 23 weeks pregnant was a physical comedy I was not prepared for, The combination of an altered center of gravity and the determination to be independent producing a sequence of events that ended with Ruben carrying every box that weighed more than 15 pounds while I directed traffic and pretended this was a collaborative arrangement. He assembled the furniture. He did this with the focused precision of someone who finds this kind of work satisfying, measuring twice, checking levels, consulting diagrams with genuine interest. I sat on the floor with my back against the wall and watched him build my bookshelf and thought, this is what it looks like when someone chooses to be in your life. Not the grand gestures, not the declarations, though he had made one of those too, quietly and precisely in the middle of a storm. The bookshelf, the measured twice, the checking that it was level. When it was done, he stood back and looked at it and said, that is good. I said, it is perfect. He said, the third shelf is a fraction off level. I said, Ruben, it is perfect. He looked at me. He said, acceptable. I said, high praise. He sat down on the floor next to me, which was something he would not have done 6 months ago, not because he lacked the ease but because we had not yet built the kind of closeness that makes sitting on floors together feel natural. Now he just sat down next to me and we looked at the bookshelf together in the half-assembled apartment that smelled like new paint and cardboard. He put his hand over mine on the floor between us. I turned my hand over and held his. We sat like that for a while in the quiet of a new place becoming familiar. The pregnancy became visible in the way that made it impossible for anyone to pretend otherwise, including me, which I had been doing in a low-level unconscious way for weeks, moving through my days with the information compartmentalized rather than integrated. At 26 weeks the compartment stopped being useful. There was a person in there and they were making their presence known with a directness and consistency that I was beginning to think might be genetic. My mother laughed when I told her this on a video call. She said, you were the same. You made yourself known early and often. I said, great. Ruben came with me to more appointments now. Not all of them, I did not require that, and he never pushed, but when I asked he was always available in a way that suggested he had made himself available on purpose. He sat in waiting rooms with his folded magazines and he asked the midwife questions that were more technically detailed than the questions I asked, because he was an engineer and he thought in systems and loads and tolerances. And the midwife had started addressing the technical answers primarily to him while giving me the human summary. Which I found both slightly amusing and oddly touching. On the drive home from the 24-week appointment he said, she is going to need a specific kind of support cushion. The midwife mentioned it obliquely but I looked it up. I will get one. I said, Ruben, you do not need to. He said, I am aware I do not need to. I said, then why? He said, because I want to. Because it is useful. Because taking care of things that can be taken care of is the thing I know how to do well and I want to do it well for you. I said, that is the most romantic way anyone has ever described buying a support cushion. He said, I was not attempting romance. I said, I know. That is what makes it romantic. He did not respond to this. But there was a quality to his silence that I had learned to read as something like pleased. The support cushion arrived 2 days later. It was the correct one, researched and chosen with a thoroughness he brought to structural calculations, and I used it every night and it was genuinely a significant quality of life improvement. I texted him, the cushion is excellent. He texted back, I know. I laughed at my phone in my apartment 2 floors above his. It happened naturally, the way most things with Ruben happened, without a formal conversation or a decided moment. Just the gradual accumulation of evenings until one evening became morning and neither of us had moved. I had been in my apartment for 6 weeks. It was a Wednesday, late, we had eaten dinner at my place for the first time in the evolving rotation of his kitchen and mine. And the food had been good and the conversation had been easy, the kind of easy that takes time to build and then feels like it was always there. The record player I had bought, secondhand, a birthday present to myself, was playing something slow. At some point I had ended up leaning against him on the couch, his arm around me, my feet tucked up, the lamp making everything amber. At some point I had closed my eyes. At some point I had registered, in the soft distance of half-sleep, the feeling of being still and held and in a place that was mine. In a building that had become mine, next to a person who had been making himself mine one careful deliberate gesture at a time since a midnight in November. I woke up at 4 in the morning. The lamp was still on. He was asleep, his head dropped slightly to one side, his breathing even and deep. I lay still for a moment looking at his face in the lamplight, the hard lines of it gone somewhere softer in sleep, and I thought, here is the person I want to be waking up next to. I got up very carefully so as not to wake him and turned the lamp off and came back and pulled the throw blanket over both of us and settled back into the warmth of the space I had made against his side. He did not wake, but his arm pulled me closer in sleep with the automatic certainty of something that had been true for longer than either of us had been saying. In the morning he made coffee in my kitchen with the stovetop pot he had brought me as a housewarming gift, which was also the most practical housewarming gift I had ever received, and I sat at the counter and watched him and thought, so this is it. This is what it looks like. He brought me my tea and sat across from me at the counter. I said, "Good morning." He said, "Good morning." I said, "You stayed." He said, "Yes." I said, "Was that all right?" He looked at me steadily. He said, "Kip, staying here is the most all right thing I have done in 3 years." I wrapped my hands around my mug. I said, "That is a lot to say at 6 in the morning." He said, "I have been thinking it for some time." 6 in the morning seemed as good a time as any to say it. At 30 weeks, I had the conversation with my job about maternity leave, which was stressful in the way of all conversations about money and time and what an employer considers reasonable, and which ended in an arrangement that was not everything I had hoped for but was workable, the particular brand of outcome that leaves you feeling like you negotiated well enough to not be angry about. I told Ruben about it over dinner. He listened. He asked questions about the arrangement with the same systematic precision he brought to load calculations, identifying the variables and the weak points with a clarity that was useful rather than alarming. By the end of dinner we had a spreadsheet open on his laptop and a reasonably solid picture of the next 12 months. I said, "When did you become so invested in my finances?" He said, "When they became related to your well-being." I said, "And my well-being is your concern?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Ruben, that is a lot of responsibility to take on voluntarily." He said, "I am aware. I did it voluntarily." I said, "You knew all of this. You knew from the hallway what the whole picture looked like." He said, "Not all of it. But enough." I said, "And you still opened the door." He said, "I could not have done otherwise. I told you that." I looked at him across the table with the spreadsheet between us and the lamp on and the evening fully settled, and I thought about that night in November, the rain in the hallway and the garbage bag and the deadbolt sliding home. And I thought about how a single door opening had rearranged everything. I said, "Ruben, I want to ask you something." He said, "All right." I said, "What do you want?" "Not what you are willing to do, not what you have decided is your responsibility. What do you actually want?" He was quiet for a moment. The good kind of quiet, the thinking kind. Then he said, "I want to be the person you call when something goes wrong. I want to be in the room when things go right. I want to cook in your kitchen and sleep in your apartment and drive you to appointments and build your furniture and argue with you about narrative structure. I want to be there when the baby comes, and I want to be the person she grows up knowing is constant. I want, at some point when you are ready, to not be living 2 floors below you but in the same place. I want the whole of it, Kip. I am not being careful about that anymore." I sat across from him. I said, "She." He said, "The midwife said." I said, "You remembered." He said, "I remember everything about this." I got up from my chair and went around the table and stood next to him, and he turned toward me and I put my hand on his face. The hard-lined, careful face that I knew now in every light, and he put his hand over mine and held it there. I said, "I want all of that too." He said, "I know." I said, "Stop saying that." He said, "You gave it away in the body language weeks ago." I said, "I hate that you notice things." He said, "No you do not." I said, I do not." He stood up and I was in his arms in the way that had become the most familiar feeling in my life over the past months, solid and warm and deliberate, and outside the window the city was doing its evening things. Traffic and lights and the pigeons on the ledge who had apparently extended their schedule from his floor to mine. I said, "When did the pigeons find my floor?" He said, "Pigeons are territorial but adaptable. They follow routine." I said, "Are you comparing yourself to my pigeons?" He said, "I am not comparing myself to your pigeons." I laughed against his shoulder. He held me more tightly. My daughter was born on a Thursday in late April, at 7:42 in the morning, in the hospital 2 miles from our building. In a room where the window faced east and the early light was coming in by the time everything was finished. Ruben was there for all of it. He had been there from the first contraction at 2 in the morning, when I had knocked on his door, which was, in honesty, more of a pounding because the contraction was making it difficult to be precise, and he had had his jacket on within 45 seconds, which I know because I was timing contractions and he was in the doorway and the gap between 2 of them. He was not someone who performed calm. He was just calm, the structural kind, the load-bearing kind, The kind that comes from having decided in advance what the priorities are and holding to them when things get loud and complicated. He held my hand through the parts that required handholding. He spoke to medical staff in the even, specific way that gets information and action without friction. He did not tell me it was fine when it was not fine, which I valued enormously because I could not have tolerated it. When she arrived and they put her in my arms, I looked at her and thought, there you are. I have been carrying you all this time and here you are. She had Darian's nose, which I had been slightly worried about and which turned out to be perfectly fine on her face. A good nose, a nose with no narrative attached to it, just a nose. She had my mother's forehead. She had, as far as I could tell at 7:42 in the morning in the east-facing light, her own eyes, which were the unfocused dark of newborns and which I thought I could spend a very long time looking into. I looked up at Ruben. He was standing beside me and he was looking at her with an expression I had not seen on him before. Not any of the versions I had catalogued over the months, not the work focus or the reading absorption or the careful attention or the rare and precious unguarded moments. This was something else, something that had been waiting, I thought, for exactly this. He said, very quietly, hello. He was talking to her. She did not respond in any meaningful way because she was 7 minutes old and had other things to process. But she made a sound, a small involuntary sound that was not crying and was not nothing. And Ruben Strong, the scariest man in the building, looked like someone who had been given a gift he was not sure he deserved and was going to spend the rest of his life making certain he earned it. I said, do you want to hold her? He said, yes. I said, are you sure? You do not have to yet. He said, I have been sure about this for longer than I have said. The nurse helped with the logistics of the transfer and then she was in his arms, this tiny certain person, and Ruben held her with the careful exactness of someone who had. I realized, probably researched how to hold a newborn, and she looked up at his face from her position against his chest and he looked down at her. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, she is extraordinary. I said, she is 7 minutes old. He said, that does not make it less true. I leaned back against the pillow. The east light was full and warm on the ceiling. Outside I could hear the ordinary sounds of a hospital morning. Inside the room it was just the three of us and the light. I said, Ruben. He said, yes. I said, I love you. He looked up from her face. He looked at me with the directness that had always felt like standing in front of something open. He said, I know. I said, say it back. He said, I love you. I have been saying it in various ways since November. I am glad to say it in words again. I said, you can say it in words more often. He said, I will try to remember. She made the small sound again. He looked back down at her. He said, quietly, to her, I will try to remember. We were married on a Saturday in October, 18 months after she was born. It was not a large event. We had both agreed on that without negotiation, which was how we agreed on most things, by each arriving independently at the same answer. A small place, a small list of people, the things that actually mattered without the architecture of performance around them. My mother flew in. Della was there, and Petter from work, and the woman from apartment 7 who cried enthusiastically from the moment she arrived and who I had, over the course of the year, developed a genuine fondness for despite her because of her comprehensive knowledge of everything that happened in the building. Ruben had 3 people from his life before the city, colleagues and a friend from university who he did not see often but whose existence in his world I had come to understand was important in the way of deep roots you do not need to water constantly. Our daughter, who we had named Ren because we had both said the word independently looking at different things on the same afternoon and then looked at each other, sat through the ceremony in Ruben's arms because she had recently decided that Ruben was the preferred carrying option and enforced this preference with a consistency that he found reasonable and that I found both slightly insulting and entirely understandable. He said his part in the ceremony with the same directness he brought to everything. No tremor, no looking away, no performance. Just the words, said to me, meaning exactly what they said. Afterward, at the small dinner we had in a private room in a restaurant 3 blocks from the building, my mother danced with Ren to the music the restaurant was playing and Ruben and I stood at the edge of the room watching them, his hand in mine. I said, are you happy? He said, yes. I said, that was fast. He said, some things do not require calculation. I said, that might be the least engineer thing you have ever said. He said, I have my moments. I leaned against his shoulder. He turned and pressed his lips to my hair in the way he had been doing since that first morning in my kitchen. The gesture that was both the smallest and the most precise summary of everything. I thought about the hallway. I thought about the rain and the garbage bag and the deadbolt and the chain. I thought about the door that had opened at the far end of the corridor in the dim light. I thought about the man who had walked toward me in the flickering fluorescent light and asked, "Are you hurt?" I had said, "I am fine." I had not been fine. But I had become fine, over months and a new apartment and a bookshelf measured twice and crackers through a bathroom door and jazz records and a storm and a Thursday morning at 7:42 and a Saturday in October. I had become fine in the specific way of someone who has been built into someone else's structural calculations. Held, accounted for, part of the load-bearing design. I said, "Ruben." He said, "Yes." I said, "Thank you for opening the door." He said, "Thank you for sitting in the hallway." I said, "That was not intentional." He said, "I know. The best things rarely are." Ren, from across the room, held out her arms toward him with the imperious certainty of someone who had decided the current arrangement needed adjustment. And Ruben excused himself from our conversation with the small almost smile that I had learned to treasure above most things, and went to collect our daughter, and I watched him go, this tall, careful, extraordinary man, and thought, some doors, when they open, do not close. They become the way into everything. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Subscribe, drop a comment, and I'll see you in the next story.